Learning, of course, is something that happens in the brain, and neuroscience tells us how the brain works. So what everybody's holy grail is for neuroscience to inform what happens in the classroom. What we are starting to see now is an effort to really do controlled experiments. What kind of teaching is most effective at letting children learn both initially and in a more enduring way? What kind of input? What sequence of learning? What modes of learning? Whether children learn best from hearing, from seeing, from doing, from feeling, from interacting with their peers, from just hearing what a teacher or maybe if a computer tells them. That's what everybody hopes neuroscience will speak to.
Education at one level is nothing but brain plasticity. Anything a parent or a teacher achieves with a child, shares with a child, inspires in a child, has to go with a physical change in the brain that underlies that learning in parents. And so how those two things meet, this is a physical rise of the brain and the experience at schools and home, is an exciting challenge for these coming years to understand.
Remember to squeeze the top of the eye drop and then put it in?
Part of education must be to give every child a better brain, a stronger brain, to actually change their neurology positively so that they can take in more information. What substantially controls their ability to do that is the efficiency with which their brain operates in a very fundamental sense. And those basic skills and abilities are plastic. They're subject to improvement, they're subject to change, they're subject to modification. And if we change them in a positive way in a young child, what a gift. What a positive thing that can be for the child in life going forward.
With recent breakthroughs, research is showing that neuroscience offers this key to highly effective learning for all children. Join me at the intersection of science and education as we explore the new science of learning. Scientists have long believed that during the first several years, the brain is hardwired for life. But over the last decade, a growing body of educational neuroscience has shown that the brain is constantly changing, and we can dramatically, positively, and permanently impact the learning and lives of children of all ages and abilities. This transformation is possible if we understand how to best utilize the brain's own neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity basically means the freedom and flexibility to learn, to change, to not be mechanically rigid or constrained, unable to move and change. So when we talk about plasticity of the brain, what we're talking about is the brain can learn there. Children go through a period when they first come into the world where they're completely wide open to learning.
It's tough to be a baby. Maybe you've forgotten. But, it's pretty scary when you first come into the world because everything is new. And every day is a new experience. And you're laying down that experience of, have I seen this before? If not, I better explore it because this might be really important. The gates are wide open for little babies. They're absorbing things like a sponge.
Children come ready to see a world filled with angles and with spaces, with support and with physics, with human beings that they can recognize. And it's in that mix that they are discovering how the world around them works and how to interpret patterns.
Much of early brain development and behavioral development is beginning to build up a model of the world that a child can use to guide his or her behavior. And the more powerful that model of the world, the more powerful the child's ability to negotiate the world.
In early childhood, the brain goes through what is known as the critical period. This is a special period of time when plasticity is taking place on a large scale. But it's just the beginning of a lifetime of plasticity.
And we used to think that there were these critical periods of development that lasted to a certain point, and when you pass them, bang, door slammed shut. And that was it, and you've got to deal with what you got.
Which of course was a very grim way of looking at things. It was really the idea that children had one shot at this, and if they missed it, either through outside circumstances because they had disabilities, they would never get a chance to recover. And we now know, of course, that that is largely incorrect.
An amazing thing happens in the early life of a brain across what we call a critical period of brain development. The plasticity itself is unregulated. Whatever sound flows into the brain, it changes the brain, it specializes it, it optimizes it. So it's very important in the brain that this initial period of sorting go right. That actually create a construct of the world that can operate on and say, it's this that I'm going to listen for, to try to make sense of, to try to give meaning to.
This specialization is a result of complex chemical reactions inside the brain. Tiny neuromodulators like dopamine, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine are released to strengthen specific neural pathways.
The brain itself is rewarding itself. If you do something and your brain fires and you get a little burst of neuromodulator that says that one was right, save it. It has to be in a particular time window. If it comes too late, you don't know what you were supposed to save. You could have been saving the one that was just wrong. So building in the ability to give these very little short bursts of timely rewards and frequent intense input is what's driving the neuroplasticity in a positive direction.
Our brains are constantly working to make associations and attempt to predict what will come next. Our model of the world and all of our organized behaviors are based upon this prediction. When the brain gets that prediction right, it's very satisfying from a neurological perspective.
An example that I can give is that in electrophysiological studies, they have actually a whole brain wave potential, which is showing what the brain does when you expect something to happen and it doesn't. So for example, if I say, I like my coffee with cream and sugar, your brain does one thing to the word sugar. When you say, I like my coffee with cream and spaghetti, your brain gives you a completely different and very robust response. So brains are looking for expectations and predictions and have very pronounced physiological occurrences and consequences for the wrong thing happening.
When the brain can't accurately predict, it can greatly impair all aspects of learning, from the classroom to the social environment of the playground.
Navigating the social environment is something that children in school actually spend a lot of time doing. Well, if you look at a bunch of different facial expressions, those facial expressions are typically tied to a different type of outcome. For example, the person with the angry facial expression is usually not going to say something nice to you. The person with a smile is likely to say something nice to you. If you don't know how to predict, you wouldn't know who to approach or who to avoid as a playmate. So say that you don't really understand that association, that the angry face often results in, nasty behavior. You might be a child that continually goes up to the angry child and gets rejected or is bullied, and that leads to a very bad playground day, which transfers to typically a pretty bad day in the classroom thereafter. So these things really play into all aspects of our world.
Prediction within the brain is governed by the principles of neuron or brain cell behavior. Uncovered by neurologist Dr. Donald Hebb, the principle is summarized as neurons that fire together nearly simultaneously in time wire together.
Look what I did! I put the cake under another big bowl.
Language is a pervasive aspect of development, from interaction with family and peers to even how we talk to ourselves. Not only is it the conduit of information among humans, it's also the foundation of most learning.
The way our civilization is set up, you have to learn language in order to learn anything else. Children who are at a disadvantage in reading, to say nothing of being at a disadvantage in hearing, just struggle and struggle to keep up, to get anywhere in school.
Even before they enter a school environment, though, language plays an enormous role. When babies are born, they're citizens of the world, able to adapt to whatever language they're born into. Long before they learn to speak, a baby's brain is focused on language.
Children are amazingly adaptive. You know, it doesn't matter what language you're born into, your brain becomes a specialist in creating a representation, a processing machine that's ideal for just that language.
In the beginning, babies can discriminate all the sounds of all the languages as newborns, but they discriminate them acoustically, so they can hear the sound differences. And then once the outside environment begins to influence them, they become much more tuned to their native language.
Let me give you an example of sounds that one might not hear. In the Japanese language, there isn't a single word that differentiates its meaning based on a contrast between and okay? In English, of course, we have many, right and light, red and lead, we can go on and on. Now, Japanese infants are perfectly capable of discriminating the from the sound up until about 6 to 8 months of age if they're not being exposed to anything but Japanese. And at that point, they no longer act as if they can hear the differences because they haven't been stimulated.
And it's not only which language is spoken, but also the quantity of that language that can have an enormous impact. More exposure to a language can be a predictor of later academic success. A study of children aged 7 months to 3 years by researchers Betty Hart and Todd Risley demonstrated that disparate families could differ by as much as 300 words spoken to their children per hour.
Now, not just the quantity, but also commonly, the more you talk, the more complex the language. We also see great disparities in the use of language in relation to the child. A child can come from an environment in which the language is almost always corrective. The parent is saying, "Stop that, Johnny. Quit doing that, Mary." Always discouraging, or almost always discouraging. And we know there are other households in which almost everything that is said to the child interactively is positive. And a way to go, Sally. Nice job, Billy. So these two children come to school, one from a rich and elaborate language environment where language has always been positive, another from a relatively sparse language environment that's been uncomplicated, unsophisticated, where language has been substantially corrective. One child wants to talk. Talking is rewarded. Talking is nothing but good news. The other kid identifies talking with trouble. Talking is nothing but bad news. Now, if we just look at those two children, and we look at their prospects, and we're talking now about great statistical averages, but if we look at their prospects for going forward, we know that the two children sitting on these different sides of the distribution will be different in their reading ability when they enter high school by more than 5 years. So children that come from rich language environments in which language is positive in their life will be more than 5 years ahead of children as readers who come from impoverished language environments.
But advances in neuroplasticity are showing that this trajectory can be changed. To understand how we can best influence this, we need to understand the basic components of language that impact learning.
At the grossest level, we think about expressive language, our ability to speak and express ourselves using words. But there's also receptive language, the ability to understand what other people say to us and follow that. And so those are the two big divisions. At the very basic level, we have what's called phonology, or the sound system of a language. We think of those as the speech sounds called phonemes, and it's the phonemes that are the building blocks on which we put syllables together, words together, and ultimately sentences and phrases. And when it comes to learning how to read, actually it's a phonological code that we have to break. We have to become aware that words as units can actually be broken down into smaller sounds, the phonemes, and it's those sounds that go with the letters.
Delving into how we develop language is part of the research of neuroscientist April Benasich. At her lab at Rutgers University, she studies language development in infants. Her research shows that they're not passive learners, but rather focused and engaged. Her insight comes from deciphering a specific pattern in the brain called gamma waves.
You like him? Can you get him? Get that doggy. Yay!
When your brain is just sitting quietly, one of the things it's doing is oscillating. And when you're measuring EEG, which is electroencephalogram, we measure it putting a soft, stretchy sort of shower cap on the baby. You can break the quickness of the oscillation down into various bands. And one of the bands is the gamma band, and that's the highest frequency band. And the interesting thing about gamma is that that's kind of what your brain uses when it's working really hard, because what the gamma oscillations do is they link together further away areas of the brain. When you look at studies of adults and they're doing a difficult task and you're monitoring their brain waves, what you see is when they're doing something very difficult, their brain shifts into gamma, and you see this burst of gamma oscillation. So it's kind of like, okay, I'm using everything here. You know, I'm connecting everything up. People were surprised that we were able to measure that in these very young children.
Show me which one you ride on. Which one do you use to drink your milk? Which one goes on your feet? And which one do we watch cartoons with?
So we were looking at 16 months through 36 months. And that's the time when children have this big burst of language and cognitive competence, where they go from having, 5 or 10 or 12 words to gaining like 1 or 2 words every day. We looked at normal, healthy babies with no family histories of language impairments or anything. But we do have a group of kids who are at higher risk because they have someone in the family who has a learning disorder. And those children have a much higher incidence of themselves developing an impairment. And as young babies, they seem to be developing absolutely the same, you can't tell. But if you look closely at the way they're processing information, the way they're segmenting what's coming in and being able to process very fast, successive sounds, overall we found that the power, the amount of gamma in the brainwave predicted how good they were at their language and at their attention. When we looked between the groups, we found that children that were at higher risk for language disorders had lower power as a group. We can look at those children pre-language, and we can predict with about 90% accuracy from 6 months out to age 3 which children are going to be impaired in their language. The oscillation might be the mechanism by which the children are able to put together the sounds that are coming in very rapidly in time. So it's telling you something very specifically about the underlying substrates of the brain, the things that support language. And we're examining things that are not language, but it's the basis on which language is being built. And so we can get some clues about what the child is going to be doing later.
Dr. Talal was one of the first scientists to describe a fundamental difference between children who were having difficulty and those who weren't. The difference was not in their hearing, but in their ability to process sound in the brain.
Those children were different primarily in how rapidly their brain could organize sensitive, brief, rapidly successive information acoustically. And the hypothesis was that that was interfering with these children's language development because it was making it difficult for them to hear the fastest acoustic changes that told their brain which fast consonants they heard in rapid succession. I started looking at developing a series of little tasks to see what these children could do with sounds. We found that if you asked them to say something like pa pa pa, they could do that. Ta ta ta, they could do that. Ka ka ka, they could do that. But if you asked them to say pa ta ka, the child would go pa pa ka.
So if their brain's a little bit slower than it should be, the difference between a ba and a da is about 40 milliseconds, very, very fast. And if the baby's not able to interpret that coming in, they have to use repetition and they have to use context to figure out what the sound is, and that slows them down and it makes them less efficient processors.
And it turns out that many of the children who suffer from dyslexia, their auditory neurons literally cannot pick up these very, very fast sounds. It would be as if, there were a flash of light, but it was too brief to register.
Dr. Talal attempted to solve this problem by artificially elongating a brief auditory flash using computer-synthesized speech.
I used a computer to artificially stretch out the time over which these critical acoustic changes were occurring that the brain had to grab onto in order to hear these acoustic differences and ultimately set these sounds up in our mind. And the children did much better.
Over the course of many hours a day, 5 days a week, over the course of a couple, 3 months, the children's auditory neurons were retrained, and suddenly they were able to pick up the sound of these fast phonemes. And the children are suddenly, for the first time in their lives, able to draw a correspondence between a sound that they hear and a letter or a written word on the page. And suddenly, when they're told, this letter makes this sound, it makes sense to them.
The meaning of each word is derived from the phonemes. For instance, the words pat, cat, and hat all have different phonemes at the beginning, which change the meaning of the word. English, for example, has 26 letters, yet it has 44 phonemes.
When you come to learn to read, what do you have to do? You have to become aware that words can be broken down into the smaller sounds, the phonemes. And if your brain didn't store them that way to begin with, or stored them enough so that there were fuzzy boundaries between bas and das and gas, you're not quite sure what you heard, then it's going to be very difficult to put that letter on that sound.
If you can bring children up to speed in terms of their very, very basic language abilities, and that would be just hearing correctly, then you can make huge strides in their other cognitive abilities.
Almost all children can bring a better brain to any learning situation if they harness the power of neuroplasticity and improve the building blocks of learning: memory, attention, processing rate, and sequencing. These skills are essential for learning and reading success. But in order for any change to take place in the brain, there needs to be motivation.
Motivation underlies all learning, and it's perhaps the most underappreciated feature. I mean, we don't live in a neutral world.
We know that children are active, not passive learners. That means that they need to go out there and feel it and touch it. We know that children learn when something is meaningful, just the way you and I do.
When the challenges that they confront in a learning situation are within their reach but not easy, we know that if we create the circumstances where an individual has a prospect of succeeding in a learning opportunity or in a learning situation, and they are succeeding a fair amount of the time, that this is an important part of motivating people to remain engaged in that learning situation.
In order for children's brains to perform optimally, their bodies must be exercised as well.
People fail to recognize that our bodies are sending our brain feedback constantly. And so if your body is not in a good state, you're getting all this feedback from your body to your brain saying, hey, I don't feel well, and it sends you into a different mode, a survival mode rather than a real functional mode. Our bodies also need to be used a lot, and so you don't want children to be so restless that they can't attend in class because their bodies haven't been used enough. The other important thing is that exercise changes neuromodulation. Cortisol, which is one of our main stress hormones, can be degraded following rigorous physical exercise.
Cortisol is a stress hormone, and managing stress is a hallmark to creating a solid foundation for learning in the brain of a child.
We talk about good stress, in which we have this sense of mastery and control, generally a good outcome. We're willing to take challenges, feel exhilarated. And then you have what we call tolerable stress, where something bad happens. It happens, to everybody, but you have a good sense of oneself, good self-esteem, and you have support systems. And then you have the toxic stress, where you have something bad happens, but you don't have any of these resources. And that's when a person gets into a sort of a negative spiral that can affect physical and mental health.
It can be difficult for children to understand the concept of stress, much less be able to explain that they're feeling it. It's important that adults monitor the level of stress in a child's life, and this can be done by paying close attention to transitions.
Is it difficult for them when you say, okay, now we need to get dressed and do this? They have to actually leave one item, so they have to disengage from something, and then they have to move on to another item. They have to be able to carry out a sequence of events, like getting dressed and, tying their shoes, etc., and then move on to a whole new venue. A stressed out child has a hard time actually disengaging and re-engaging and giving that effort. So often you can look at how they're dealing with transitions. And the other thing that's very important to note is that children quickly are in tune with an adult's physiological state. And so if the adult is stressed out, the child will be. So one of the most important things for a teacher or a parent is to be able to modulate their own physiological signs to be calm, so that the child can also get into that state.
To drive neuroplasticity in a positive direction, we must focus on the building blocks of learning. The first building block is memory, an essential component for effective learning, including word recognition, reading comprehension, and the ability to follow instruction.
Maybe the biggest discovery in the last 30 years about the human brain in terms of learning and memory is that we have different kinds of memory in our brains. So our brains are like symphony orchestras, and we have multiple instruments that are specialized for different tunes.
The hippocampus alone is not where memory resides. There is memory there, but there are lots of other areas that are involved in memory. It's much more integrated than one would suspect. For example, think about an apple, and it's on the table, and it's red, and it's round, and it smells a particular way, and it grows on the tree, and you know that you can make a pie from it, and you remember what your grandmother did, so you have all this information about the apple. Most of those pieces of information are stored in different parts of the brain. And yet, when you see an apple, just like that, all of this information comes together. How does that happen? We don't really know. Amazingly enough, we don't really know. And we can't even get a computer to do something that fast. But one of the hypotheses is that gamma oscillations are actually one of the mechanisms by which we pull all that information together. So that when you're storing that information in those different places about that apple, brain cells in different areas of the brain are oscillating together, and they sort of mark the information.
These brain cells, or neurons, are connected together by synapses, and these synapses can be elaborated through use.
There's something called a strength of a synapse. So for instance, if you can teach about, let's say George Washington in art class and in music class, as well as in history, as well as, let's say, in drama class, that allows so many ways into this George Washington neuron that the child is much more likely to be able to access it. All of these can be very, very potent ways to strengthen the synapses that are, again, the biological manifestation of learning.
The second building block of learning is attention, which is not only our ability to focus on a certain task or information, but also our ability to ignore distracting influences.
Attention is something that converts just basic sensory signals into something that can leave an enduring footprint in the brain.
It is important to recognize that attention is a set of skills. It does improve with maturation, but it's something that has to be exercised. And of course, we also need to look for their interest. Someone interested in music, for example, can spend many hours practicing and so on, because their interest carries them along.
2, 1, 2.
We know know that after certain periods in a child's life, and they're usually early periods, that if you want to change the actual wiring of the brain, the way the brain really is doing things, it requires active attention. That's what learning is all about. Children who are poor at language learning skills were different in their brain's selective attention component, measured physiologically using electrodes. Then they did these neuroplasticity-based training studies, and they found that after about 6 weeks, they reanalyzed the brainwaves of these children and found that they no longer were significantly different in selective attention. So they showed you can absolutely change something as basic as the physiological brain response to selective attention. Now, learning is all about selective attention.
And attention works best when the information is accurately and efficiently processed in the brain, which is the third building block of learning. Processing, or processing rate, is the speed at which one can perceive and manipulate information.
Well, a lot of times if you're trying to teach something to someone that's very difficult, you break it down, okay? And you have to systematically approach the appropriate state for that person. So you change things very slowly. If you're training a kid to play baseball, you don't put them out in the major leagues. You're going to teach them how to catch something very slow and close to them, and you're going to make systematic changes over time, and their system tunes up to that. For some reason, we didn't take those lessons in the sensory and intellectual realms where, oh, if the verbal information is coming too quickly, let's slow it down and systematically speed it up until they can handle it.
We're having difficulty keeping up with the information, and so we forget what's going on. So think about, you're picking up the phone and it says, you know, if you want English, press 1, if you want Spanish, press 2, if you want international, press 1, if you want national, and you're like, I gotta hang up and start over. If something's coming in too fast and I'm struggling to keep up, I'm gonna fall behind, and I can't therefore think about the content of what I'm trying to learn. I'm lost in the instruction. Think about a child sitting in the classroom and the teacher says, open your book to page 32 and read the first 3 paragraphs and answer questions 1 through 5. If a child is processing just a little bit more slowly, they could have comprehension of all the speech and language, but if they can't keep up with that, they're stuck on open your book.
Processing rate can be improved by cognitive training, literally, exercising the brain.
It's like weightlifting, right? If my trainer starts with weights that are too hard for me, I'm going to go down there, try to pick them up, and if I can't pick them up, nothing's going to happen good for my muscles. It's the number of reps I can do. And a good trainer is going to figure out what it takes to keep you motivated, so eventually over time I'm going to be lifting heavier weights and building better muscles. And the brain is very similar in that respect. We have shown that we can get a 4-fold change in just this simple variable of neuroprocessing time. We can get tremendous change in memory and attentional capacity, and the research has been done to show it.
Processing impacts a rich language beyond that of just words. A child's ability to understand and act upon nonverbal cues is critical to social learning.
You look at some of these children, their social skills are problematic because, again, their timing is off. A lot of children who have speech and language problems have difficulty with social interaction, and everyone assumes it's because they can't talk as well as the other kids. But it's more than that. They don't get the joke. They don't give the nonverbal feedback. It takes their brain just a little bit longer to process whatever is going on, even nonverbal cues of other children. And other kids pick up on it so fast and shun the child.
Processing rate is not only essential for language learning, it's essential in social interactions as well. This sensitivity to the precise timing of social interactions can be observed even in toddlers. Robotic studies at the University of California at San Diego led to insight into processing and timing using a robot called Ruby.
It's got wavy hair and eyebrows that move and all sorts of body parts that move, and it's a cute little robot.
Ruby is really a project, bringing robots to a childhood education center and understand what it takes to develop robots that are safe, and capable of interacting with toddlers, whether or not it's possible to develop long-term relationships between this technology, sociable robots, and the children.
The children were interested in it for a little while, and then they weren't interested anymore. And of course, to make something useful for learning, the children have to be interested on an ongoing basis. So they worked and they worked and they worked and they worked on all sorts of different things.
One day we discovered that we actually had a problem with one of the motors in Ruby, and because of that problem, the head was moving too slow. And the day we solved that problem, so that Ruby started moving her head more like the human movement, that very same day, the children started pointing so that Ruby would look at things that they wanted her to see. They would actually follow Ruby's line of regard. But we feel that one thing that was crucial was the fact that we were hitting the statistics of movement, people moving their heads or biological motion. And once you hit that, this magic appears. You can't help but feel that Ruby is alive.
Another building block of learning is sequencing. There's a fundamental order to the world, and understanding and properly adhering to the sequence of events and actions underscores every moment of our daily life.
Top of the legs, up, and stretch into the ball.
Time is just a pervasive feature of our world. It's inescapable. And what that does is create an order of events. So inherent in everything in life are sequences. And it's something we don't necessarily realize, that the basic function of keeping sequences straight is very, very important to just about every aspect of learning. You need neurons in the brain doing the right thing at the right point in time. If they're going to work together, one neuron needs to predict what the other neuron is going to do next, because they need to work as a team. And so part of learning is that tuning up process. If you have an incoming sensory input, like some big ball flying at you, you need to know what to do with that ball that's flying at you, or it's going to hit you in the head. That would be bad. All right? And so you may have a neuron fire in response to that. The next neuron needs to know when to fire in relationship in order to have the right response occur. That whole community of neurons builds up its own response. They sort of yell out to the next brain area. And then the communication continues like that. And so sometimes you get these sort of waves of activity, and they can occur even on different time scales. And eventually, this 100 billion neurons needs to have the right pattern of activity across all the neurons to give the motor system the right output. Because you have all this parallel processing, all these things happening at the same time in the brain, but you don't want a lot of different things happening with the body that are conflicting. You want the right single sequence of actions to come out.
Sequencing connects the building blocks of learning together. An inability to properly sequence can lead to chaos. For instance, in language.
Every language has a particular syntax, and inherent in that is the ordering of words in order to create meaning within the listener. And so in English, for example, if we say the frog jumped over the child versus the child jumped over the frog, that's a very different meaning. The order of operations in a mathematical sentence is also very important. So if you were to take, just multiplication and addition and group them differently, you get a completely different answer. So if children can't learn the order of operations properly, they're not going to be able to accomplish a mathematical sequence. People may think that they have a real problem with mathematics, but it could be their basic sequencing ability.
Every day, millions of students across America enter schools, eager to learn, awaiting the next academic challenge. But all too often, this hopeful story becomes a downward spiral of thwarted ambition, as struggling children see a mounting lack of success as a personal failure. This could be the story for any child, and it was the story for Willie Brown, a student in Chicago.
thought I was normal and fine in first, but second grade is when I started really noticing a problem, and my teachers and other people started noticing my reading. I wasn't reading as good as I should. Spelling, I couldn't really spell at all.
We were reading something, and I had read it to him, and I needed him to read it back to me, and he would have his little finger on the line, and he would be going across. And his eyes, he looked at me, and he said, "Mommy, what is wrong with my brain?" Mrs. Ketchum, that was his teacher. I remember when she called me and she said, I'm not sure why he's having such a hard time, because he really does pay attention. He doesn't disrupt the class. He's focused.
People have thought that one of the main reasons that children that struggle in school is because they're lazy. Science that's emerging now show that there really is kind of infrastructure in the brain reasons why these children are struggling, and it's not a matter of effort.
Reading is an incredibly unnatural process. Our brains were not evolved to read. On the one hand, it's a miracle that our brains have the capacity to read. On the other hand, it's a hard-earned miracle because the child needs a lot of supervision, a lot of instruction. They need a lot of practice and a lot of highly focused activities that create plasticity in the brain that allows them to become effective readers. So many children struggle, and for them, then they start to have a sense of failure or difficulty at school, which is exactly what we don't want a child to have. We want them to love school, we want them to love education and love to learn.
So in order to understand how reading works, you have to first understand how language works. And just as we're talking right now, the difference between the use of the word bad and dad, right, or lad, is less than 1/10 of a second in the soundscape of language. It's moving that fast, right? So if my speech is moving that fast, reading actually has to create this artificial version of it moving that fast. When babies first come in, very early, most of them have little mobiles in their crib with A's and B's and C's floating around, and people say this is an A and this is a B, and so their mind starts to get wired and fired to associate that letter with that sound, and everything's fine. Until such time as you put these things together. When you start to put these things together, A no longer sounds like A. They have all kinds of different sounds. They're almost like, instead of having a fixed and determined correspondence between letters and sounds, each letter represents a field of possible sounds.
My teacher, Miss Fry, she had a spelling bee like every Friday, but usually I didn't usually participate because I couldn't spell that good. And so this one particular time she had this Ninja Turtle action figure. She always had a prize or whatever. So I was like, oh man, I had to get that. And so she wrote the words on the board for that Monday. You had to practice them. And I practiced the words so much, I would memorize them. They were like pretty much drilled in my head. That Friday I came, I raised my hand, and I got up there, and I started to say the words, but the words that how she had it written on the board wasn't how she was saying them. She had them kind of mixed up, so I got like pretty much every word wrong. Kids kind of snickered, laughed, like, man, I'm never getting up speaking again, and sat back down.
At the request of his teacher, Belinda had Willie tested for learning disabilities. The school administrator called him to his office to give his diagnosis.
Pretty much straightforward. Told my mother I would never learn how to read, that I would need assistance all my life. So I was discouraged after that. Pretty much now, my mom started getting phone calls from teachers and the principals. Willie's being disruptive in class. Willie's suspended for 3 days. Willie can't come back to our school.
We bring innocent young children into a school environment, and then more or less witness their failure. And we see their growing sense of self-worth. Instead of being nurtured and growing and becoming positive and developing into somebody that really values themselves and sees themselves as an effective, competitive, active member of our society, basically they turn against themselves. They see themselves as the source of their own failure. They see themselves as unable to compete in this most elementary of ways, in succeeding in the academic realm, where their failure to succeed is interpreted by them and by people around them as, in some sense, their fault.
I thought my future was going to be pretty much a violent one. Gangs, I remember we lived in the neighborhood that we lived in. It was gang infested. I was a perfect target for a kid with no hopes, no dreams, and no ambition. I was headed to a dark, cold place.
Willie tells me, Mom, give it up. I'm just not gonna learn. I'll be okay. You know, I'm cool. I'm a thug, you know. And I told him, as I told his younger brother, you can't join no gang. You're already in a gang. There was 5 of us. Okay? You in my gang. I refuse to lose my child to the streets. I refuse to lose him to drugs. I refuse to lose him to all that crap that was out there.
I would rather for you to feel that I was bad and I had a behavior problem than for you to say he can't read, he has a learning disability.
Both neuroscientists and psychiatrists and psychologists that have studied this have kind of come to the conclusion that children, in order to be more socially safe, right, will act out. They'll become the class clown. They will get angry. They'll become a bully. They'll become emotionally troubling to others because it's a distraction away from the problem that they're having. Right? So the classic statement is they'd rather be bad than dumb.
All my life, pretty much during school, I was told that this was gonna help me. If I try my hardest and I focus and I do my best, this is gonna help me. And all my life I was disappointed. Every time it didn't work out.
By the time Willie was in high school, he had given up. But his mother had not. And when she learned of a brand new approach from an instructor at his school, Ms. Egley, she begged her son to give it one last chance.
I'm like, great. I'm gonna have to read words I don't know how to read and write stuff I don't know how to write. You know, I don't want to do this. You know, because I knew the routine of the testing for reading. But it was different. It was these high-pitched sounds and this and dad and bad. And I kind of looked over to Ms. Egley and I said, don't I need to learn how to read words to be able to read? And she said, just trust me. Just trust me. I said, okay. So I was like, this is not even helping me. You know, I think I need to get back to class. And that's when she was like, you know what, it's like lifting weights. Those first 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you're not gonna see results. But that second, third week, you're gonna start seeing that bulge.
Pretty soon, Willie experienced the payoff of his cognitive training.
We were driving down Hiawassee, and there was a sign on Metro West Boulevard. And Willie read the sign.
I just used to like to look at the pictures. I see the billboard and I seen it and I read it. And I knew that's what it said. And I looked back and I was just like, wow, you know, Mom, I just read this.
And I remember even his brother and his sister were like, Mama Willie read that, you know? And that was like, you would have thought I won lotto. You would have thought I won lotto.
So everybody's just like, what's this one? This one, just pointing out stuff. And I remember I was just reading. And that had to be one of the happiest times of my life, and I will never forget it. For somebody who knows how to read, it comes easy. For somebody who just got it, it's just like getting $1 million. For somebody who always had $1 million, it's gonna be like, it's nothing. Someone who got $1 million, like, man, we rich, let's go somewhere, let's do something. That's how reading is for me. I want to become a teacher. It's about changing lives and somebody going back and saying, you're the reason why I'm this way. You're the reason why I'm successful in life. When people do ask me that, they say, why do you do this? And I say, I speak for the underdogs, for the ones where people don't think they're gonna succeed in life, the ones that people have written them off, teachers have written them off. You know, I speak for them, you know, because no one else will. So I thought, you know, I have to speak for kids just like myself.
By utilizing the dramatic neuroplasticity in children, we can help to transform their lives and change their trajectory. And we can do this when we exercise their brains using the building blocks of learning. And if we want to drive positive changes in each building block, it needs to be done individually and adaptively. Each building block intersects with the next, establishing a solid foundation for all learning. The first building block is memory.
Clearly memory is important, because if you paid attention to something and you got it, but you didn't remember it, it's not going to really allow you to build over time this base of content. And again, your memory span and the different types of memory that we have for different kinds of information is something that turns out to be highly plastic. It is highly changeable based on experience and based on training. You can actually improve the memory of individuals throughout the lifespan.
Attention works in tandem with memory, allowing information to be fixed in memory without distraction.
To maintain sort of optimal attention, it turns out, you need a little bit of uncertainty, you know, to maybe not quite be at 100%, I know this is going to happen, to maintain attention to that feature and to still want to learn about it.
I think we all know that you know, when we find that thing that really is something we gravitate to and that we find ourselves, we feel successful in, and that that you know, turns us on, basically, that's when our learning is most dramatic and most efficient. And so we want that experience for children. But we have to acknowledge that not all children are the same. And they will not all find the same things engaging. And that's the challenge for us in education.
Processing rate is the third building block, and it plays an essential role in learning. Research has shown that infants with faster auditory processing develop better language and reading than those with a slower processing rate. And good language, be it spoken or written, is the foundation for lifelong success. But processing rate is highly plastic. Creating a dynamic, accurate, and fast processing rate requires sharp attention to drive positive changes.
Analogy that I like to use is a computer analogy. Not that I think a brain is a computer, but literally we have some kids coming into the classroom with dial-up speed. Their brains are processing at the speed of, you know, you could think of it as dial-up, and other kids are fortunate enough to have broadband, and some of them have really fast broadband. What we want to do at the higher cognitive levels with our computer requires rapid processing and good memory. Well, the same is true for children. It's true for all of us at all ages, that the speed of processing is really critical to how much we can remember, how much we can pay attention to, and particularly how much we can learn.
Sequencing is the building block of learning that places a timestamp on the order of actions and events, allowing the brain to predict likely outcomes and create meaningful patterns. Sequencing ties together all of the building blocks, creating an accurate and complete model for the brain and the child to act upon.
Sequencing is involved in everyday things like getting dressed. You see many times in adults who begin to have a breakdown of their cognitive function and their ability to learn. They focus on the memory part, but if you really look at it more carefully, it's a sequencing problem in many, many cases.
Utilizing neuroplasticity to strengthen the building blocks of learning leads to a strong foundation for any learning situation. And having an active involvement in the world of our children is also critical to bring the lessons of neuroscience into our homes and into their lives.
As adults, we get it. Use it or lose it. Keep your brain active. Keep working on learning. Keep working on putting in new information and potentiating what is going to happen is much more important in development.
One of the most important things that parents can do to nurture and steward the healthiness of their children's learning and the trajectory of their learning as they, from the time they're born to the time that they enter school and even after they enter school, is to engage them in a dialogue. The child is expressing their feeling with their body, with their eyes, with their coos, with their tones, and the mother or father is echoing that back or feeding that back, and there's a conversation going on, even if it's before words. That conversation, the quality of that participation, that dialogue, that engagement, is at the core of what is exercising the child's healthy participation in their own learning.
Any brain training is most effectively applied using an adaptive strategy, in which basically you start by defining what the brain can do, and then you slowly adaptively drive it in the right direction to empower it, to improve its processing, to make it more effective.
We're learning more and more about when the best time is to intervene. It's never too late. It's never too late to do something to help a child with language or with reading. And I think that in early infancy, in order to address some of these problems, you may just have to gently nudge. And that is the difference, in that it will allow something to happen in a much more natural kind of way.
If we go back and rethink our educational system with this new perspective, that we want to maintain lifelong learning and try to understand what's going on in the brain that allows us to be able to enhance learning, I think that will help us to reformulate how it is that we teach children.
When we evaluate the success of a child academically, the evaluation is primarily based upon what they know. And that's really reflecting something that's hidden to us. And what's hidden to us is the ability, the success that the child has had, how easy it's been for the child to gather that information. What if that ability, in fact, is plastic? Which of course it is. Age of the child doesn't matter. It's continuously plastic. So we can see children that are of a high school age, that have never succeeded in school, that have failed continuously across school and see themselves as a failure. And we can see those children go through a remarkable revolution in their ability to take in information with efficiency by appropriate brain training. So in fact, this ability to make the brain more powerful as a receiver and manipulator of information applies throughout the school ages of children, and in fact throughout life.
The potential, the promise, and the possibility of each child is immeasurable. As a society, we don't have just one hope for our children and their future. We have countless hopes and dreams. By using neuroplasticity, we can help children approach any learning situation with a brain that is quicker, sharper, and stronger. A brain built for wherever their imagination and ideas may take them. When neuroscience and education come together for the benefit of our children, ourselves, and our world, this is the new science of learning.